Tuning into the Agora Underground here on the Voluntary Virtues. Every Saturday, 8 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Dispelling the illumination of status sophistry with the dark web of agorist philosophy. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are live and we are jiving. Comrade Dick here, your host for the Agora Underground here on the Voluntary Virtues Network. And we have quite a show lined up for you guys. Thanks for tuning in. Quite a show indeed. We have been, as you well know, going through Murray Rothbard's magnus opus, his huge, big contribution to the economic field, Man, Economy, State with Power and Market, a very systematic breakdown of economics, no hype, no slander, no rhetoric just for the sake of it, but rather a very systematic scientific breakdown of the Austrian school, and really just the school of economics as a whole, the science of economics. And we have been going through conservation laws, ladies and gentlemen, have been going through the different enactments and laws and regulations that the state imposes upon the free market in regards to how much they can consume, how much we're allowed to consume certain things. Before we get started here, it is just a side here research topic for all you folk that are keeping up with what's going on in California, or has been going on for the last couple of years. I had no idea. I figured it was just the last 2 years, but apparently it's been going on for quite some time. And great example of how conservation laws really end up doing the exact opposite of what they're supposed to, and environmental laws in general. Well, guess what? So apparently their mountain range they got over there that melts down, and of course you got river water and all this glacier ice water essentially melting off. Streams get started and lakes fill up and rivers get going, and it all goes out to the ocean. And before, I guess farmers were redirecting those rivers, that water flow, that precious water, and using it for their farms, right? For their homesteaded farms. And of course, we can't do that anymore because, hey, that water is very precious for the many animal life in the coast there, and especially, unendangered. I say that again, unendangered fish that they need to keep alive for whatever reason. Way more important than our food, right? So, yeah. So apparently, California's been barring people from collecting water and redirecting their, water to irrigate their own farms, in the name of conserving the environment, right? In fact, I think they got you down to like 5 gallons a day for each person, right? And in the real tough areas. And state of California, on another completely unrelated issue, had to dump quite a bit. I mean, I think it was a couple million gallons of water, perfectly good water that went bad because they were holding on to too much of it. And something happened with the chemical reaction of the sun constantly beaming down into the chlorinated water, and it caused, I guess, poisonous reactions to come about, and it was deemed undrinkable by for human consumption, and inevitably dumped. So definitely things to look into as far as conservation laws. And I mean, there's just so many examples and points to make that we can be here all day explaining that. So might as well get into the nitty gritty, what we're actually getting into tonight. And that is we were just wrapping up, and let's get all this mirror effect here out of here. Just wrapping up the whole conservation laws. I think we got a page or two here. Then we go on to patent laws. So definitely stick around for the ride. Should be a fun one. So we had read how essentially we finished up last week or the week before that. I think it's been 2 weeks since we last spoke, and basically this this restriction on here's giving an example of land. A restriction on habitable land, right? Land reserves and stuff like that, land that people aren't allowed to use, creates an artificial scarcity or an artificial lower supply, right, of land that you can live on, right? Because we could be living on so much more, but now since you've restricted us, it's a lot less land, so there's less to sell, less to live on, and this leads to the intended, right, by many, and consequences of land prices definitely going up. Definitely going up, because if you got the only land in the town, in the state, if you got, well, not necessarily all the land, but there's less to deal with, right? I mean, you don't have to have all these acres and acres and acres of land to deal with as well, and to throw into the market, which keeps all that at a lower rate. So we'll see what other points here are made. He's probably going to continue on with that. So let us return to the government's policy of reserving timberlands. This confers a restrictionist price and a monopoly gain on the land remaining in use. Now, land markets are specific and do not have the same general connexity as labor markets. Therefore, the restrictionist price rise is confined far more to lands that directly compete or would compete with the withdrawn or reserved lands. In the case of the American conservation policy, the particular beneficiaries were A, the land grant to the Western railroads, and B, the existing timber owners. And again, it's easy to see why this was the case, right? Western railroads were given the sole monopoly, essentially, of having the right to build railroads through these reserved lands, and timber owners, timber manufacturers, timber companies that did have their timber industries going. They were definitely having to compete with less timber that was available, so that they gave them the right to raise prices on their timber. Lots of it to go around. The land grant railroads had received vast subsidies of land from the government, not only rights of way for the railroads, but 15-mile tracts on either side of the line. Government reservation of public lands greatly raised the price received by railroads. When they later sold this land to new inhabitants of the area, the railroads thus received another gift from the government, this time in the form of monopoly gain at the expense of consumers. This is, I mean, so many times there's these multiple layers of money entanglement that we're just so naive to wanting to actually perceive, right? I mean, it's a muddy world out there, and we just don't like getting dirty. Here's a side note. Another example of government creation of monopoly gain in land has been cited by the Georgist economist Mason Gaffney. Quote, city governments all over the country deliberately keep dead lands off the market with the avowed purpose of protecting other land prices. Gaffney cites the head of the American Society of Planning officials as advising that a vacant 1/3 of urban land be more or less permanently removed from private ownership in order to keep up land values for the owners of the remaining 2/3. Gaffney concludes, following this advice, many state and local governments avoid returning tax reverted lands to use. Mason Gaffney vituperation Well, answered Land and Liberty, and this is 1952. So, and reprinted by Spencer Health here, Progress and Poverty reviewed. So, wow, I mean, this is interesting here. Cities actually deeming certain areas of their little jurisdiction here as to be permanently removed from private ownership. I mean, wow, interesting. It makes just wonder how many places I drive by, that are just areas that have been deemed city property, right? To take up land for to control the market. Interesting, to keep property value higher than what it should be. Interesting. So, the railroads were not ignorant of the monopolistic advantages that would be conferred upon them by conservation laws. In fact, the railroads were the financial angle of the entire conservation movement. Thus, Peffer writes that there was a definite basis for the charge that the railroads were interested in a repeal of various laws permitting easy transfer of the public domain to the hands of private settlers. They wanted to get rid of that. The National Irrigation Association, which was the most vigorous advocate of land law reform outside of the administration, was financed in part by the transcontinental railroads and by the Burlington and the Rock Island railroads. The amount of $39,000 in that year, a year out of the total budget of around $50,000. The program of this association and the railroads, as announced by James J. Hill, a permanent railroad magnate, was also more advanced than that of the leading conservationist. So, wow, a program announced by the Association of Railroads by James J. Hill was more advanced, was more progressive, was more extreme than those of the same conservationists themselves. Pretty hardcore. So here we see probably stuff we want to get into as far as things you want to read into and consider if you're so against big business. These all these regulations are actually put in there by them to keep their power. So that's just another example there. The timber owners also understood the gains they would acquire from forest conservation. The President Theodore Roosevelt himself announced that the great users of timber are themselves forwarding the movement for forest preservation. As one student of the problem declared, the lumber manufacturers and timber owners had arrived at a harmonious understanding with Gifford Pinchot, the leader in forest conservation, as early as, well, that's crazy here that even Roosevelt was quoted as saying that the timber industry was wanting to take care of timber. That's interesting. As early as 1903, we had Gifford, leader of forest conservation, meeting up with manufacturers in timber and lumber. In other words, the government, by withdrawing timberlands from entry and keeping them off the market, would aid in appreciating the value of privately owned timber, of those that were allowed to cut down trees. How to artificially raise prices in certain markets? You just outlaw the use of certain lands, and then that way there's only a certain amount of timber available. So I guess you get to raise the prices. Neat little trick there. Here, this reference, Peffer, closing the public domain, page 54, also pointed out that the railroads paid $45,000 annually to a leading conservationist magazine, The Talisman, and financed the Washington Conservation Lobby. Yeah, I mean, it really makes you wonder, right? I mean, everyone behind where's all the money from Greenpeace coming from? I mean, it's really private donations are keeping one of the biggest conservationist organizations going. No, it probably is a bunch of monopolists, a bunch of industrialists that definitely gain by banning people from being able to use land, right? Because then they become the only landholders. So yet again, we see how conservationist laws don't really do diddly squat. And I really do encourage you guys checking out what's happening in California, like I brought up earlier, with the water shortages and how state of California is having to dump a bunch of water out because they were just holding on to too much of it. They're trying to conserve too much of it, and it went bad. Chlorine mixing in with the sunlight, and not only that, but the water from running off from the mountains every spring when the ice melts, they're not allowed to redirect that to their farms because hey, they're trying to conserve the river water, the spring water coming into the ocean to protect wildlife there. But apparently, we're not wildlife. I guess we're human beings are expendable, whereas bait fish are unendangered bait fish. I guess we can't lose too many of those. I mean, it's just craziness. Just craziness. So we do have patents here coming up. Quite an interesting section, I'm guessing. And yeah, I think it's like 3 or 4 pages. So yeah, we should definitely be able to wrap it up in this section, in this episode. And I definitely look forward to this one because so many times, right? I mean, just bringing this stuff up with people, they kind of give you that bewildered look. They don't know what you're talking about, or they don't see, I guess, the magnitude of how patents distort the market and harm us. So understanding it better, I think, would be a benefit for all of us. So let's see what Rothbard has to say about patent laws and patents in general. So a patent is a grant of monopoly privilege by the government to the first discoverers of certain types of inventions. Some defenders of patents assert that they are not monopoly privileges, but simply property rights in inventions, or even in ideas. And before we really get started on this, just as a side note, libertarianism is a little divided on this. I mean, it has evolved over the years as to what it believes on patents. I mean, you might find people, Lassiner Spooner, for example, who defended the ideas of patents until death, until for basically forever. I mean, and then being passed on to your family and this and that. So definitely a diverse set of opinions and ideas. So, like with everything that we say, we definitely encourage logical evaluation and reevaluation of everything. So where were we? See here. So in the free market or libertarian law, everyone's right to property is defended without a patent. If someone has an idea or plan and produces an invention, which is then stolen from his house, the stealing is an act of theft, illegal under general law, under common law, right? You can't break into someone's house and take their property. On the other hand, patents actually invade the property rights of those independent discoverers of an idea or an invention who happen to make the discovery after the patentee. So yeah, some guy makes a certain gear ratio or transmission, and then someone else figures it out afterwards on their own, independently of this other person, and now they can't use it. They can't do that. They can't use their own invention because someone else already patented it before them. That's an example. There's an example of how that person's property rights were infringed. These later inventors and innovators are prevented by force from employing their own ideas and their own property. Furthermore, in a free society, the innovator could market his invention and stamp it copyright, thereby preventing buyers from reselling the same or a duplicate product. And copyright is very different than patent laws. I mean, it's easy to throw them all in the same boat of intellectual property, but there are obviously there's different names, so they must mean different things, and there's different applications to these different intellectual property rights. And copyright is quite different. I mean, copyright is the explicit purpose of copying something in order to make money off of it. So copying, the latest freaking Star Wars coming out in this Christmas or whatever, in order to sell it on the streets of New York or whatnot, right? You are copying something that someone else made for monetary gain. and thus in some way kind of taken away from what would have initially been theirs. So there's more argument towards copyright for sure versus patents here, as Rothbard pointed out. So we'll see where we go with this, patents, therefore, invade rather than defend property rights. The spaciousness of the argument that patents protect property rights and ideas is demonstrated by the fact that not all, but only certain types of original ideas, certain types of innovations, are considered legally patentable. Numerous new ideas are never treated as subject to patent grants. Yeah, so there are different standards, I guess, for that. Interesting on this. Interested to read this side note here. Basically, the patent was instituted in England by King Charles I as a transparent means of evading the parliamentary prohibition of grants of monopoly in 1624. Interesting. So, Parliament wants to break up monopolies, and King Charles I basically comes in with the idea of patent laws. Well, hey, I patented that, so you have to give me that right. Interesting, and I definitely got to get more into that history of that. So, yeah, definitely interesting here. So not all ideas are considered patentable, legally patentable, especially with philosophy, right? You can't patent a agorism, right? You can't patent a philosophy, Buddhism. So why can't we? How come you can patent other things like whatever, a shoe design or something? So numerous new ideas are never treated as subjects to patent grants. Okay, so another common argument for patents is that society simply makes a contract with the inventor to purchase his secret so that society will have use of it. But in the first place, society could then pay a straight subsidy or price to the inventor. Right, why just not buy it off of them instead of giving them these patent rights, right? It does not have to prevent all later inventors from marketing their inventions in this field. Secondly, there is nothing in the free economy to prevent any individual or group of individuals from purchasing secret inventions from their creators. No monopolistic patent is therefore necessary. Interesting stuff. I mean, you can always reverse engineer something. So long as you don't make it exactly the same, so long as you're basically not duplicating, if you reverse engineer something and figure out how it works, then you can design your own version of it. No, nothing wrong with that, in essence. The most popular argument for patents among economists is the utilitarian one, that a patent for a certain number of years is necessary to encourage a sufficient amount of research expenditure towards inventions and innovations in new processes and products. So yeah, you hear this. This is probably one of the most common arguments for patent laws, is that what would be the motivation for inventors or investors to get into new technologies and design new things if they can reap financial benefit from doing so. A decent argument, right? I mean, at least at face value. So he says here that this is a curious argument because the question immediately arises, by what standard do you judge that research expenditures are too much or too little or just about enough? Resources in society are limited, and they may be used for countless alternative ends. By what standards does one determine that certain uses are excessive, that certain uses are insufficient, etc.? Someone observes that there is little investment in Arizona, but a great deal in Pennsylvania. He indignantly asserts that Arizona deserves more investment, but what standards can he use to justify such a statement? The market does have a rational standard, the highest money incomes and highest profits. For these may be achieved only through maximum service to the consumers. This principle of maximal service to consumers and producers alike, an example to everybody, governs the seemingly mysterious market allocation of resources. How much to devote to one firm or another, to one area or another, to the present or the future, to one good or another, to research rather than other forms of investment. Very poignant logical point here is that supply and demand and profits and losses are what allocate resources the best. You don't want somebody that you don't want resources allocated based on someone's whimsical ideas or their guesses or people's feelings. You want resources dispersed based on where the highest demand is, where the highest return is, right? This would serve the greatest value. This would serve the greatest purpose for that. The observer who criticizes this allocation can have no rational standard for decision. He has only his arbitrary whim. So true. This is particularly true of criticisms of production relations in contrast to interference with consumption. Someone who chides consumers for buying too many cosmetics may have rightly or wrongly some rational basis for his criticism. But someone who thinks that more or less of a certain resources should be used in a certain manner, or that business firms are too large or too small, or that too much or too little is spent on research or is invested in a new machine, can have no rational basis for his criticism. Businesses, in short, are producing for a market guided by the valuations of consumers on the market. Outside observers may criticize the ultimate valuations of consumers if they choose, although if they interfere with consumption based on these valuations, they impose a loss of utility upon the consumers. But they cannot legitimately criticize the means, the allocations of factors by which these ends are served. Very interesting. Very interesting. So many people want to impose their subjective values upon everybody else. Isn't that so true? I like chocolate, therefore everyone has to eat it. Capital funds are limited, as are all other resources, and they must be allocated to various uses, one of which is research expenditures. On the market, rational decisions are made with regard to setting research expenditures in accordance with the best entrepreneurial expectations of future returns. To subsidize research expenditures by coercion would restrict the satisfaction of consumers and producers on the market. Of course. No one's ever forced to do something that that would benefit themselves and essentially others. We're all forced into scenarios that aren't beneficial for us, right? I don't know why people don't get that. Don't get me wrong, not to get confused with the very valid point that basically freedom, right? Responsibility involves more of an effort, involves more long-term planning. It involves more sacrifice in the sense of savings, putting away the expenditures of now for future expenditures. But no way to know. So when it's forced, it's just, I don't know why people get it. I mean, like, again, like what I was saying, I mean, I don't know why I lost my train of thought there, but I mean, essentially, right. I mean, we know that things that are good for us, working out, eating healthy, these things take an effort, right? They take a concentrated effort at first, at least to form the habit. We're not talking about that. We're talking about when you're forced to do something against your will, is most often than not because it's not good for you, or at least not good for your subjective value scale. So many advocates of patents believe that the ordinary competitive processes of the market do not sufficiently encourage the adoption of new processes, and that therefore innovations must be coercively promoted by the government. The same argument we have for roads, essentially, right? I mean, we don't, roads are so much of an investment that private firms simply don't have the capital, the resources to be able to sufficiently build the roads, right? To be able to sufficiently fund these gigantic projects. Same thing with dams, right? Stadiums. Basically, they believe that we need a massive amount, massive amounts of, reallocated wealth to be able to deal with these demands in society, because I guess society is just too greedy and selfish to want to invest in such things, or crowdsourcing and funding and stocks aren't going to do it. So we need government, right? And this mindset and this worldview tends to be the worldview that doesn't understand business too well at all. But the market decides on the rate of introduction of new processes, just as it decides on the rate of industrialization of a new geographic area. In fact, this argument for patents is very similar to that of infant industry arguments for tariffs and import taxes. That market producers are not sufficient to permit the introduction of worthy new processes. And again, the answer is the same, that people must balance the superior productivity of the new processes against the cost of installing them. An example, against the advantages posed by the old process in being already in existence. It's up for them to decide at what point it's valuable to then transfer over to the next technology. When is it valuable? When is it an actual profit? Exactly. When is there a profit motive to want to invest in new technology and new processes? This is something that the each firm, each industry, each business, and each individual needs to decide for themselves. Can't be some standardized level that everyone's forced to achieve, because we just don't know if that's the if there's any levels after that, if we needed to learn something in between there. Just so many factors in this stuff. So important to realize that you know the market weighs out at what point it is productive and worthwhile to invest in new technologies. So conferring special coercive privileges upon innovation would needlessly scrap valuable plants already in existence and impose an excessive burden upon consumers. Exactly. I mean, you can't just keep forcing the new innovations on down to everybody's throat. I mean, there needs to be a lag time of actual implementation and a testing period as well, right? I mean, it takes time to get feedback on these new technologies and come out with new variations of it and to build upon it. So all in its time, right? All in its due diligence. So nor is it by any means self-evident even that patents encourage an increase in the absolute quantity of research expenditures. But certainly we can say that patents distort the allocation of factors on the type of research being conducted. Yeah, I mean, how do you say how much we're gaining, right, through patents? I mean, you can't quantify that. We don't know otherwise. And really the key point being is that people's property is affected by these patent laws. Just look at the farmers in Canada being affected by Monsanto, thanks to patent laws. So for a while, it is true that the first discoverer benefits from the privilege. It is also true that his competitors are excluded from the production in the area of the patent for many years. And since the latter patent can build on an earlier related one in the same field, competitors can often be discouraged indefinitely from further research expenditures in the general area covered by the patent. Interesting. So it's diverting. We don't know how much we're losing or gaining in investments towards new research, but we do know that it's being redirected. That we can definitely quantify, or at least pinpoint. Moreover, the patentee must himself is discouraged from engaging in further research in this field, for the privilege permits him to rest on his laurels for the entire period of the patent, with the assurance that no competitor can trespass on his domain. Interesting too. And the second side of the coin is that, yeah, I mean, if you're got a patent, then what's the point to keep up the with new innovations, right? You can just coast on that for as long as you can. The competitive spur to further research is eliminated. Exactly. Research expenditures, therefore, are overstimulated in the early stages before anyone has a patent, and unduly restricted in the period after the patent is received. In addition, some inventions are considered patentable while others are not. The patent system thus has the further effect of artificially stimulating research expenditures in the patentable areas, right? Because you want to coast off that patent, while artificially restricting research in the non-patentable areas. Interesting, interesting. Another way to direct, right, funds and research and money essentially is you introduce patent laws, and now everyone, and you only allow for certain things to be patent and other things to not be. So now everyone's scurrying to invest money into research into things that are patentable, so they can get the first one, so they can be the first ones to get the patent. No one's really researching the things that aren't patentable. Great points here. Great points. But just gotta love that logic. As Arnold Plant summed up the problem of competitive research expenditures and innovations as such, neither can it be assumed that inventors would cease to be employed if entrepreneurs lost the monopoly over the use of their inventions. Businesses employ them today for the production of non patentable inventions, and they do not do so merely for the profit which priority secures. In active competition, no business can afford to lag behind its competitors. The reputation of a firm depends upon its ability to keep ahead, to be first in the market with new improvements in its products and new reductions in their prices. Mm, Gotta love that. That's what the market wants to do, is going to constantly push towards. Patent laws, on the other hand, definitely a form of stagnation here, and redistribution of, or redirectioning of wealth towards things that are overstimulated. Sounds like patents and Keynesianism goes hand in hand, don't it? So finally, of course, the market itself provides an easy and effective course for those who feel that there are not enough expenditures being made in certain directions on the free market. They are free to make these expenditures themselves. Those who would like to see more inventions made and exploited are at liberty to join together and subsidize such efforts in any way they think best. In doing so, they would as customers, add resources to the research and invention business. And they would not then be forcing other consumers to lose utility by conferring monopoly grants and distorting the allocation of the market. Very important. Always distorting the market, aren't we? Always doing it. When will we learn? When? Their voluntary expenditures would become part of the market and help to express its ultimate consumer valuations. Furthermore, later inventors would not be restricted. The friends of invention could accomplish their aims without calling in the state and imposing losses on the mass of consumers. I mean, this is just net loss, right? All these interventions are always going to be net loss at the end of the line, right? At the end of the whole production cycle, and that is the consumer, that is the buyer. They're going to take the load on that. So that or labor, right? I mean, essentially, it's those two. That's it. So patents, like any monopoly grant, confer a privilege on one and restrict the entry of others, thereby distorting the freely competitive pattern of industry. In If the product is sufficiently demanded by the public, the patentee will be able to achieve a monopoly price. Patentees, instead of marketing their invention themselves, may elect either one, to sell their privilege to another, or two, to keep the patent privilege but sell license to other firms, permitting them to market the invention. The patent privilege thereby becomes a capitalized monopoly gain. It will tend to sell at the price that capitalizes the expected future monopoly gain to be derived from it. Licensing is equivalent to renting capital, and a license will tend to sell at a price equal to the discounted sum of the rental income that the patent will earn for the period of the license. A system of general licensing is equivalent to a tax on the use of a new process, except that the patent receives tax instead of the government. Oh, except that the patent receives a tax instead of the government. Okay, yeah, I get it now. So interesting. It's this argument here that it's a monopoly on the patent privilege becomes a capitalized monopoly gain. It's you want to talk about the atrocities of that Proudhon and Marx and the rest of them, Hodgkins or whatever. When you want to get into, when you want to really get into their hollering and their crying, their defaming and their ousting of rent, and for all its supposed atrocities, and how it's I guess a unwarranted excess on capital, on land, or on capital goods that you're constantly renting out and making money from, and infinitum, essentially. I mean, this is way worse here, right? I mean, this is like a step up, a step or two above that. Patent laws. So this tax restricts production in the comparison with the free market, thereby raising the price of the product and reducing the consumer standard of living. It also distorts the allocation of resources, keeping factors out of these processes and forcing them to enter less value productive fields. As usual, that's tends to be the common thing. I mean, again, if you're going to distort the market and invest in certain things, or patent certain things, or conserve certain, restrict the use of certain things, you're going to distort investments. You're going to distort where people want to put their money. They're going to continuously adopt to what remunerates the most amount of profit for them, the most amount of return to them. So if you start inflating certain markets, or deflating, or stimulating and just messing with the market and as a whole, you're definitely going to distort consumption. You're going to distort production. You're going to distort investment. You're going to distort savings. You're going to distort so much. We don't know what the world would be like without government. We've been under, at least here in the United States, right? We've been under progressivist regulation for a century now, over a century now, and look where we're at, and people still want to blame the market for that. I don't get it. So most current critics of patents direct their fire not at the patents themselves, but at alleged monopolistic abuses in their use. They fail to realize that the patent itself is the monopoly, and that when someone is granted a monopoly privilege, it should occasion neither surprise nor indignation when he makes full use of it. I mean, just like government. I mean, here we go, right? I mean, so many people want to reform and correct the evils of government, and they obviously don't realize that government in itself is the problem, right? They don't realize that getting monopoly out of government just isn't going to happen. You got to get the government out of monopoly, right? In order to get rid of monopoly, you got to get government out of the situation. So yeah, patents, do they grant monopoly privilege? Heck yeah, they do. Sure, without a doubt. But are we then going to criticize patents because only when they give monopoly privileges and not when they don't? That's not really being consistent there. So it's all about consistency, ladies and gentlemen. It's all about figuring this out, finding out reasonable answers to this. And with these patent laws, I think my biggest personal issue with them would be the fact that, like Rothford mentioned earlier, it really really does affect the actual property rights of people. Um, you know, even patent. I mean, I'm sorry, even copyright to a degree. Um, Even if obviously, if it's intent to sell. I mean, even then, though. I mean, right? I mean, because you figure I buy a DVD, for example. Let's go with the DVD pirating. I buy a DVD, for example, and I just make copies out of them, or I sneak a camera into a movie theater and I record and make copies, right, and sell the copies. Okay. Well, I paid for your DVD. I mean, I paid for the ticket to go into the movie theater, right? Um, and I also paid for my camera, or I paid for the burner, right? And I paid for this blank CDs. I paid for the sleeves. I paid for the paper. I mean, essentially, all this is my property. So you have a copyright on something, or you have a patent on something, and now you have government thugs beating down my door, or the patent administration, or whoever the heck, coming in, beating down doors, and essentially confiscating people's property that they themselves, uh, bought and own. It's like that's kind of a dumb example, but you build a statue of I don't know, something that's copywritten, right? As Vader before he became public domain. I'm sure Lucas or Disney now, right, still has the rights on that, or has the continuing rights on that. But say you build an exact replica of Vader into a statue and you put it outside your house. I mean, does that give them the right to then take that, right? Because you're charging people to go see the Vader statue, and that's a copywritten image, even though it's all the resources put into the statue are yours. You paid for it. You paid for the person to make it. It gets muddy. It really does get muddy, and with these patent laws, it's going outside of the copyright realm here, um, of intent to sell and all this, going to patent laws in general. I mean, you can. We know that there's studies. There's been studies where people figure things out around the same time. I mean, one person on one side of the world will figure out how something about alternating current, and then someone else figures it out, or somebody on one side of the world figures out something about lighting and light bulbs, and some other person on the other side of the world figures it out shortly after, or something. I mean, there's examples of this, multiple examples, even in the animal kingdom, interestingly enough. So alluding to some kind of existential knowledge being transferred, though we are not about that here. But my point being on those is that there are cases where people come to the same conclusion or same inventions with independently of each other, right? Unknowingly working on something, you may invent something that someone else has already invented. Does that then give the government the right to come in on behalf of the person before that invented the item before, to come in and start confiscating your property that you've been working on? I don't think so. I wouldn't I wouldn't agree with that. I don't see how a free society could remain free for too long if we were to take all these things at face value, and especially at their logical conclusion. It's just society would be unfunctionable. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I mean, obviously the patents are only going to get more intense with especially the Trans-Pacific Partnership that is being crammed down our throats, and the nationalization of the internet, and all these different things. I mean, we're going to see them cracking down hardcore on patents because, in the end, they are monopolistic privileges granted to the industrialists to control the market, guys. So let's get informed on this. Let's stand up on principle, and let's voice our opinions against this crap, against all these privileges that government constantly grants to people. Just not allowed to do that. Well, folks, do appreciate you guys for tuning in. I'm going to cut a little short of this week. We're going to be back next week for sure, as usual, as always, breaking down this Rothbard, getting into the next section, which should be interesting, franchises and public utilities, these forms of governmental interventions upon the market and how they affect us. So definitely look forward to that. Again, do appreciate it, guys. Hopefully you have a blessed week in prosperity and liberty and in humanity, ladies and gentlemen. Godspeed, laissez-faire.